I'll never forget the day that I checked into the hospital with my wife and she was due to have our first son. I mean, I was 23 years old, but don't worry, I had it all figured out back then and I knew everything. So, I mean, how hard could this parenting thing be, right? I mean, you change their diaper whenever they make a mess and you feed them and you burp them after you feed them. And I mean, it's a piece of cake, right? But I mean, no one told me about changing a nasty diaper on 35 minutes of sleep. I mean, we were rudely awakened in the life of parenting in my home. And just as things with my son started to settle, a couple of years went by and we found ourselves bringing home a baby girl. More diapers, less sleep. I mean, it was out of control. And just as things once again started to settle in and we got our routine, we began to realize that my son, he had some delays in his communication and in his eye contact. And so like any concerned parent would, we contacted an organization and we had him evaluated and had some tests run. And we waited for the phone to ring. And when it did, a lady on the other end, she said, "Mr. Jones, I have the results of Eli's evaluation and I would love to meet with you to discuss them." So we scheduled an appointment. And on that day, we walked into this room and we sat across a table. And this lady looked us in the eyes and she said, "Based on our findings, your son Eli is autistic." Wait, what did you just say? I mean, there's got to be some kind of mistake. I mean, not my Eli. He can't be autistic, right? I mean, and for the next several months, we spent our time wrestling with that news. For the next several months, we spent our time thinking about how our family would look nothing like we thought that it would or that it should. And fast forward a couple of years, we began to realize some similar characteristics in our daughter Peyton. Delayed eye contact, delayed communication. And we were all too familiar with this process. So we contacted the same organization and we had the same tests and evaluations done on our little girl. So we waited for the phone to ring. And when it did, a lady on the other line said, "Mr. Jones, we have the results of Peyton's evaluation. We would love to meet with you to discuss them." And so we scheduled a meeting. And on that day, we walked into the same room and sat across the same table. And the same woman looked us in the eyes and said, "Based on our findings, your daughter Peyton is autistic." I can't begin to tell you how deeply that hurt. I can't even begin to tell you how much emotion we felt in that moment. And as we began to unpack this news again, we knew exactly what Jesus was talking about when he said, "In this world, you will have trouble." Yep, check that box. We found trouble all right. And we thought that trouble was going to be the stinky diapers and the lack of sleep. But trouble for us looked much, much different. It had a name, and its name was autism. And to be honest, we had no idea where to go from there. Now, if I were to take a step back from our situation and our circumstances, it's easy to see that pain isn't unique to my family. Suffering, it's not unique to my family. It's part of being human, right? All of us, we experience pain. All of us experience suffering. But if you're anything like me, in those moments, when I got that news, I found my natural reaction is to throw my hands up, as if I were deflecting or dodging a punch. I didn't want to be hurt. I didn't want my family to be hurt by this anymore. I'm trying to push it away. I'm putting my hands out to protect us because I want to get rid of this news, this information. Maybe you know exactly what that feels like. And then there was another season after that I finally decided, well, maybe if I turn my back, maybe if I act like this isn't happening, maybe everything will be okay. And I tried to numb myself to the pain and the suffering that autism brought. And if you're anything like me, you know exactly what it feels like to have something happen to you, to have something difficult that you're in the middle of, and you try to bury your head in the sand in hopes that whenever you resurface, everything might be okay. It's a really, really tough place to be. Maybe for you, maybe you lost your job. Maybe you can't find a job. And you're putting your hands out at the thought of being unemployed for one day longer. You want to push off those thoughts. And maybe physically you're not putting your hands out, but emotionally and spiritually and relationally, it affects the way that you treat your family. Maybe for you, maybe you're trying to have a baby. And the thought of not being able to have a child for the rest of your life haunts you. It keeps you awake at night. Or maybe you're looking for a spouse, or you're looking for a spouse that treats you well, and you have turned your back to the idea and the pain that may never happen for you. Or you got a call from the doctor, and you know exactly what it's like for them to have some bad news for you or for someone that you love. And if I were to sit down with you and you were to share your story with me, I would probably hear pain and suffering woven all throughout it. And I wouldn't blame you for putting out your hands. I wouldn't blame you for trying to numb yourself to the pain that is dealt in your direction, to the suffering that you are receiving. I mean, because what else are we supposed to do? What other option is there? Well, the good news is, whenever we open up the scriptures, we find that Paul, he's writing this letter to a church in Corinth. And he is saying, I know all of the pain that you're going through. I know all of the suffering that you will continue to go through. But there is another option. And he knows that it's natural for us to put out our hands, to turn our backs, but he's saying there's something else. There's another choice. So in an effort to encourage and inform this church, this is what he says. We do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about the troubles we experienced in the province of Asia. We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt we'd received the sentence of death. Paul says the amount of pain and the amount of suffering that they were going through caused them to question if they could continue to go on. It caused them to wonder, is this as much as we can handle? And they despaired of life itself. They wondered, is this a death sentence for us? But then he gives us the what. But then he writes the what and the why behind the pain and behind the suffering. And don't miss this. But this happened, Paul says, that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God, who raises the dead. But the amount of pain and the amount of suffering that we have gone through, Paul says, happened that we might rely on God. Now, it's really important to recognize the fact that Paul says that they weren't forced into relying on God, right? The pain and the suffering that happened to them happened so that they might, as if there were a choice, so that they might rely on God. If you were to take a slightly different look, maybe you could look at it like this. The pain and suffering that they went through happened so that they would be broken of relying on themselves. Or maybe you could say it like this. Their suffering, it led to their brokenness. Their suffering, it led to their brokenness. But there's a huge difference between these two things, suffering and brokenness. Right? Suffering is a trial, right? It's a difficult circumstance. Suffering is something that you go through and you wonder if it's ever going to be okay again. Suffering is something that hurts. Suffering is something that takes your breath away when you hear the news. It's unavoidable. Right? It's John 16:33. In this life, in this world, you will have trouble. It's a promise. You can't duck it. You can't dodge it. It is coming in our direction, and it's unavoidable. And suffering is not brokenness. Now, suffering can lead to brokenness, but suffering is not brokenness. Now, brokenness, on the other hand, is a posture of the heart. Brokenness is an attitude. Brokenness is how we see our circumstances, how we see God through our circumstances in our situation, how we see God through the pain and through the suffering. It's saying, God, I want nothing more than what Christ wants for me. It's a posture of the heart. Brokenness is a continuous choice. It's a choice that must be made over and over because you know this. Once we choose to rely on God in an area, it's so easy to step back and to say, I'm going to continue to rely on myself, right? And we don't even realize it. Brokenness is a continuous choice. It's a daily choice. It's a choice that we have to make over and over and over again. God, I want to rely on you. I need to rely on you. I have to rely on you. And brokenness, it's surrender. Brokenness is surrendering our will. Brokenness is saying, God, if I never have a baby, I'm okay with that. Brokenness is, it's not giving up on your desires. Brokenness isn't stopping the desire for anything. It's relying on God for those things. So here's my question. If it's my natural reaction, and if you're anything like me, if it's your natural reaction to put your hands out, to defend yourself, to protect yourself or your family or your circumstance, to turn your back on the pain, if that's our natural reaction, what if brokenness looks less like putting our hands out and more like putting our hands up and saying, God, I surrender. I have tried to do this on my own. I have tried and I have failed. I have to rely on you. I need to rely on you. I have no other options that have ever worked. For me, I thought that I was broken because of the amount of pain and the amount of suffering that autism caused my family. But that wasn't brokenness. That was suffering. Brokenness for me came when I finally accepted the fact that I may never be able to walk my baby girl down the aisle. Brokenness for me came when I finally accepted the fact that the Jones name might end with my son. And as hard as it was, and I know as hard as it was, I had to get to a point to where I said, God, I choose to trust you with my future, with my family, completely. And it was like a weight was lifted off of my shoulders. It was like God began to open my eyes and seeing the beautiful family that I had been missing all along. Because my family, they had become a problem to solve, something to fix. And I saw them as my greatest curse. But once I surrendered the idea of what my family should look like, once I said, God, I trust you. I might not agree all the time, but I trust you know what you're doing. I trust you can make something beautiful and have made something beautiful from this. God says, that's not your greatest curse. That's your greatest blessing. And I couldn't agree more. I wouldn't trade my family. I wouldn't trade my kids for anything. You see, I have seen pain and I have seen suffering up close. And I'm here to tell you, there is another way. So what does this look like for you? What is the difference between suffering and brokenness in your life, in your circumstance, in your situation? What does the difference look like in searching for a job, in trying to have a child, and desiring to have a child, and looking for a spouse? What does the difference look like in illness, in sickness, when you get a call with some really bad news? Imagine, through all the difficulties, through all of the pain, through all of the hurt. Imagine if we were somehow able to see that this is happening, that we might not rely on ourselves, but we might rely on God. How much freedom would that give you if you were able to believe that, if you were able to step in that direction? Now, don't think way too far down the road and what ifs. Think, what would happen today? What would happen in this moment in your relationships if you truly were able to walk in the direction of maybe, just maybe, I can rely on God. Maybe I can trust God. Maybe God can make something beautiful from what I feel is terrible. What would that do to your relationships? What would that do to your family? What would that do to your friendships? What would that do to your heart? What would that do to your relationship with your Heavenly Father?